What inspired your interest in the black press?
Well, there's a story behind that. Let me tell you the story. In the fall of 1980, I was taking a class in the history department called The Press and the Presidents, and it was taught by George Juergens, who later was married to Bonnie Brownlee and died recently. And so in this class we had to do papers, and one of them we had to do was on the Pittsburgh Courier's Double V campaign in World War II. And so I went and did this paper. I didn't know anything about the Pittsburgh Courier or the Double V campaign. And the process of doing this paper, I came across a book by a man named Walter White, who was executive secretary of the NAACP. And in this book, he said on a couple pages that he went to Roosevelt in late 1942, early 43, and pointed out to him that there were some black newspapers that were having their newsprint supplies cut back by the War Production Board, and it was causing them to have difficulties in publishing their newspapers. And Roosevelt says, I'll take care of that, and according to White, it ended shortly after that. So I went to George Juergens and I said, geez, this is a really interesting story. I know quite a bit about journalism history. I've never heard this story. And I think maybe I'll look into this. And I said, how come no one else has written about this? And George says, well, it's probably because they couldn't find any information. Now, I'd worked for newspapers 10.5 years at this particular point. And I kind of had the newspaper man's attitude that I can get anything. I mean, it's kind of an arrogance you have from working professionally. So I wrote the National Archives, or not the National Archives, the Roosevelt Presidential Archives in Hyde Park, New York. And I said, I'd like to have anything you have about this meeting that Franklin Roosevelt had with Walter White in late 1942, early 43, and, you know, any notes you have, any information you have on it. And about 3 weeks later, I got a typed letter of about 1.5 pages back from an archivist at the archive. And he says, we've gone through our usher's diary. We don't have anything to show that Walter White visited Franklin Roosevelt in this particular time period. He visited him, obviously, a lot of times, but we just don't have anything to show he went in the White House. He said, now, that doesn't mean he didn't talk to him at this time in the White House, because he frequently went in to see Eleanor Roosevelt. He could have gone to see Eleanor, and then he would have just walked to another room and seen Franklin Roosevelt. Said, anyway, we don't have anything and I can't help you. And he said, furthermore, Roosevelt didn't like to keep notes when he had meetings on controversial topics. And so that's something we would not likely think to find what you're talking about. He says, however, there is something else you ought to know. He added one final paragraph at the end of this 1.5-page letter. He said, we have an FBI report here that was done during World War II. It's more than 700 pages long, and it's about blacks in the United States. And he said, one chapter, 25 pages long, is about the black press, black newspapers. He said, if you would like to have those 25 pages, we'll sell them to you for $1 for 25 cents a page, or $6.25. So I mailed him back, sent him a check for $6.25, which is the best money I've ever spent in my life. He sent me the 25 pages about the black press in this FBI report. And the 25 pages basically listed 7 black newspapers, and 6 of them, including the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, which were the 2 largest newspapers. 6 of them were criticized roundly by the FBI for hurting the war effort by the things they were writing. And the other paper, the Amsterdam Star-News, which was in New York City, was put forth by the FBI as a model newspaper that never hurt the war effort. So they played off 6 papers against 1 paper. So I got this information, and as a result of that, and I was looking for a dissertation topic, as a result of that, I started researching this and getting everything I could out of the IU library and other places on microfilm, looking at the Pittsburgh Courier and microfilm and stuff. And I got started. And so I did all my research that was possible. Then I went on the road, and I remember that I left on Christmas Day of 1982. I left to go to the Roosevelt Library. And so we had Christmas the day before with my 2 young kids, and then I took off. I went up to the Roosevelt Library, spent 3 or 4 days there, got everything I could find there. Then I went down to New York City and went to a branch in the New York Public Library called the Schomburg Center, which is a very famous place for black documents, and it's in the middle of Harlem. The only time I'd ever been in Harlem. And I mean, to tell stories here, I would get on the bus at about 77th and Park Avenue to ride to the Schomburg Center, and I wore, like, it was in the winter, and I was wearing Levi's, and I was wearing a flannel shirt and boots and a stocking cap, and I'd get on the bus, and there might be only one black on the bus, and he was usually driving the bus. And we'd get up to, and the rest of the people were white, and then we'd get up to where Harlem started, as I recall, it was 117th Street. And by that time, there were no whites left on the bus except me, unless there was a white bus driver. So we'd go down there, and I remember whites talking to me in the bus and saying, "Are you a social worker? Why are you coming up here?" And, because they looked at me, they thought that's what I looked like, I guess. And then I'd get off the bus at 137th and Lenox Avenue, right where the Lenox Hill Hospital is. And I can't tell you what a shock it was for me, because I'd get off the bus, and as far as I could see in both directions, it was only blacks. And I thought, how many blacks have had that kind of experience when they got off a bus and as they looked both ways and they only saw white people? And I thought, this is kind of a reverse. So all I had to do was walk across the street and go in the library. So anyway, I spent 3 days there and got everything I could. And then I visited places like Yale University Archives, and I visited University of Virginia Archives. I went to the National Archive down in Washington, D.C. I went to the Library of Congress. And then I interviewed people. We interviewed 4 people that were Assistant Attorney General of the United States in World War II. Interviewed 2 reporters for the Pittsburgh Courier. Interviewed a few other people, and then I went back. And so I spent a total of 7 weeks on the road, which is an incredibly short length of time for doing historical research. And people were stunned that that's the only time I needed. But I mean, I worked hard, and I looked up stuff, and then I got back and I wrote the dissertation. So that's how I got started. And I've many times called myself the accidental traveler, because I got into this just because an archivist wrote me a letter and said in one paragraph, "You ought to look at these pages from this FBI report. We've had this here 3 or 4 years. No one's paid any attention to it." They were stunned that no one paid any attention to this World War II FBI report on blacks. And so, yeah, I was an accidental traveler. Somebody gave me a tip, and I got onto it, and then I went from there, and it made my whole career. I mean, the dissertation got published by Oxford University Press. It got a full page in the New York Times with a review written by Anthony Lewis. It got me as a historical advisor in 2 PBS documentaries about the black press. It led to other things. It's weird how things happen like that.
I agree. So for those who wouldn't know, how would you explain what the Double V campaign was and how it came about?
Well, the Double V campaign came about because James Thompson, who was a 26-year-old black cafeteria worker at a Cessna plane plant in Wichita, Kansas, in late January of 1942, wrote the Pittsburgh Courier, the largest black newspaper in the country, and suggested that blacks should fight this war and the country should fight this war with 2 things in mind: victory over totalitarian forces overseas, such as the Germans, Italians, Japanese, victory over the same types of forces in this country. And so that's a direct reference to anything that was limiting equality for blacks. So you have blacks being lynched in this country. I mean, a lot of people think lynchings went out with the cowboys and Indians. That isn't true at all. Blacks were being lynched in this country. You had blacks and whites paying poll taxes in the South to vote. The unfortunate part was many blacks could not afford a poll tax, so they couldn't vote. Blacks didn't get the same money as whites for the same types of jobs. There were all kinds of separate accommodations. There were black drinking fountains, white drinking fountains. There were white bathrooms, black bathrooms. you would get on a streetcar or trolley, and about 3/4 of the way back there would be a black strip across the top, and it was about an inch wide, ran all the way across the top of the bus. And that meant that if you were black, you had to be behind the black strip or the bus wouldn't move. And if you wouldn't move, they just threw you off and went on without you. And so these were the kind of things that were going on at this time. And so he wrote this thing and proposed a double V, okay? The double V idea immediately took off with blacks in this country. And you have to realize that blacks thought that when World War I ended, they were going to get all kinds of equality because they'd been over there fighting against the Germans. Well, it didn't happen. And so in World War II, they talked about the fact, this time we're going to get our rights. Now, that isn't entirely true what happened, but they thought about World War I and they thought about, let's do this thing. And that's obviously, this World War I experience was in the mind of James Thompson. And so they started this campaign. And the Pittsburgh Courier was the main paper that talked about it, and they called it a double V campaign or double victory campaign. The other black newspapers, which didn't want to lose circulation, talked about having several goals. They didn't call it the double V campaign in other papers. Only the Pittsburgh Courier called it that. So they went out and did all kinds of things to make this campaign become bigger and bigger. They had double V flag raising ceremonies, double V gardens. Women were wearing 2 V's on their dresses or on their blouses. Women were weaving 2 V's in the top of their hair. It was called a doubler. There was a hairstyle. You had double V beauty queens. You had pictures of blacks and whites holding up 2 fingers, you know, the victory sign, double V. They had a double V emblem, a really nice eagle with a couple of V's in it. They had a double V song, Yankee Doodle Tan, that was played over a national network. And so they had all this stuff going on. They formed double V clubs, and the Courier for 1 nickel, for anybody to send them 5 cents, would sell them a double V card, making them a member of a club, and give them a pin that they could pin on that had the double V emblem in the pin, okay? Well, the double V idea caught on and lasted for the entire war for all of the press, although only the Pittsburgh Courier called it the double V campaign. And it became a big deal. Like you know, if we're fighting Germans, for instance, that are over there and they're taking away people's rights, like, let's defeat them and let's defeat people in this country that are trying to take away our rights. And that doesn't mean go and kill them in this country like you try to kill Germans. But let's get rid of this inequalities in this country. It was a huge campaign in World War II, a very famous campaign, and it accomplished a lot of good.
What were some of the challenges that the black press faced during this time of the war?
Well, there were a number of different challenges. One of the main ones, and some of the challenges they didn't know about. Okay, they were being investigated by 7 different federal agencies in World War II, and they were aware the FBI was investigating them, because you would have FBI agents who would sit outside some of their newspapers, two white guys sitting in a car with thin ties and short hair in a black area of some city, like everybody knew who these guys were, and they would just take notes on who went into the paper, and then they would come in and harangue the editors and the publisher and say, you know, you got to stop writing about this stuff. You got to stop writing articles about communists, which wasn't illegal. And the other thing they would do, which was kind of interesting, was that they would say, oh, by the way, here's a check for X amount of money. We want your paper sent to the FBI building every week. Okay, if you're a publisher in a black paper in, say, Cleveland, I just picked someplace, and you know that your paper's going to the FBI building in Washington every week, That could frighten you. That's a subtle kind of intimidation, a kind of censorship. I mean, that was an interesting kind of thing the government did. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenges were that black publishers and editors faced was that they didn't want to be so critical that it would necessarily hurt the war effort. So they kind of had to balance between being cheerleaders for blacks, who basically were the only people that read these papers, and going out and convincing those people they're fighting for rights, at the same time not hurting the war effort. And that was a big challenge for the black editors, because if the readers didn't like what they were seeing, they would just quit subscribing to a certain paper and take another one. And circulation was very important for these newspapers in terms of the money that you made from it. So they faced those challenges, and the challenges were tough because of some of the types of things that were going on that they complained about. The American Red Cross at first wouldn't take blood from blacks, and then they turned around and said, okay, we'll take the blood and we'll only give it to blacks. Well, blacks weren't happy about that, and so you had to complain about that. The war started. The Marines and the Coast Guard and the Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force, wouldn't take blacks because they'd never had blacks. The Army said, we're 10% black, we're going to stay 10% black because that's the portion of blacks in the population of the United States. And the Navy said, well, if you want to come in the Navy, we're glad to have you, but you got to work in the kitchens. That's all blacks have ever done since the Revolutionary War. And blacks were not happy about being shunted to the kitchens. And so you had those kind of challenges. You had the challenges where blacks and white military police, black soldiers and white military police were shooting at each other in the army camps and killing each other off before they could even get overseas. And so they had these kinds of things happening. They had to keep talking about them. That was a challenge, okay? But how do you keep talking about them and not hurt black morale so much that either they won't support the war or they go out and blow up power plants and water plants and tear up railroad lines in the country? I mean it was a challenge. They were a little bit worried about how critical they should be, and yet they were very aware and that they were leading the people, not following their readers. And I mean, this is a really important point, the fact of whether a newspaper leads people or follows people. Most papers today follow people. The black press was leading people. And the blacks depended on that because so little news about them appeared in the white press. For instance, in the white press, the only things you would see would be information about famous black sports figures like boxer Joe Louis in the 30s and Jesse Owens, who won 4 gold medals in track and field in the 1936 Olympics. Yeah, the white papers would write all about that. There were famous band leaders. They would write famous singers. Marian Anderson was one of the really famous black singers. They would cover the famous entertainers, and there were a few people in the movies and stuff that fell into that category. And then the third category was crime, and the white papers write a lot about blacks involved in crime, arrested in crime, tried in crime, found guilty or found not guilty, and so they wrote all of that. And so, other than these categories, the crime, the entertainers, and the sports stars, blacks could get no news about themselves except in the black press, okay, in black newspapers. And if you're running a paper and you're not supplying what they want, by God, they will take another black newspaper. And in several of these cities, they had more than one black newspaper. I mean, Chicago had several of them. And so that was a real challenge they faced, and how critical are we going to be?
How did the black press shape the civil rights movement during that time?
Okay, and the black press from 1910 to 1950. In 1910, the Chicago Defender started a new type of black newspaper where instead of just talking about what should blacks be and how do you be successful in your job and this kind of stuff, they went to a radical paper that started criticizing the federal government for for things that were wrong, criticizing state governments, playing up sin and playing up sensational stories. I mean, they became a very sensationalistic type newspaper. And when they became a very sensationalistic newspaper, part of this was talking about very loudly about things that were wrong and things that were happening to blacks. And Chicago Defender at one point, about 1910, encourages blacks to arm themselves, and if the whites come for them at night, go to the door and shoot them down. I mean, that's strong language. And so they became this sensationalistic kind of newspaper, which was leading blacks, complaining about inequalities to blacks, and in doing so, from the period from 1910 to 1950, the black newspapers were like this because it got them circulation. For instance, when the Chicago Defender 1910 changed, it had 10,000 circulation. By 1920, it had 200,000 circulation. This was an immense gain. It became the largest black newspaper at that time in American history. Okay, so they talked about, here's inequalities, let's push for the inequalities, and they made some gains. I mean, you had the Army, under heavy pressure from blacks in the late 1930s, decided we're going to become 10% black. We're going to be exactly what the population is, 10% black. And that was a gain, because there were not 10% blacks in the Army before they did that. You get in 1944, you have the first black White House correspondent, okay? 71 years and 2 months ago is when it happened. And you would think you would have one before then, but the rule was you had to be from a daily newspaper. There's only one black daily newspaper, and it struggled to be able to afford to have a reporter at the White House permanently. In 1944, you had the first meeting of 13 editors and publishers from the Negro Newspaper Publishers Association. And that was important. First meeting, they met with the president. This was the first time in American history that a U.S. president had ever met with a group of American blacks. They had met with single blacks, but they had never met with more than one at a time. You know, and the blacks had griped about this, because how can a group of blacks come over here from Liberia and you meet with them? You know, they're from foreign country. Why won't you meet with us? I mean, that, you know, blacks really angry about this. Finally, they met and they talked with the president. They were able to ask him questions. Suddenly, with a black White House correspondent, he was able to go to the press conferences, ask questions. In other words, blacks suddenly had a chance to talk to the president of the United States in a kind of a limited way, but they still had a chance to do it. And so that was a big gain. And so there were all these gains that were made from 1910 to 1950. And the black press was riding high in influence and power. You had a study in the 1930s that showed that the two most influential units or groups in black communities were ministers and the black newspapers. The black newspapers, however, had a lot more power because of how many people they reached a week. In other words, you had the Pittsburgh Courier that would talk to 350,000 people a week. I mean, that's a lot of people. They had 15 editions that had 350,000 readers. So Pittsburgh Courier had an edition in New York. They had one in Los Angeles, Kansas City, Houston, St. Louis. I mean, they just went all over the country. And so that's why they had so much power. Well, you go through this period from 1910 to 1950, the black press is riding on a high. Then you get to 1950 and they start losing power and influence rapidly, mainly because the white press finally decides to start hiring some blacks to work on the white press, and they were hiring blacks who had a college education, okay? And they were hiring them because they finally decided, well, maybe there's some news we aren't covering, okay? And in the 60s, late 50s and early 60s, it becomes particularly important when you have riots in black communities in this country. And white reporters have to go in with the police and come out with the police. Black reporters can go in anytime. They can come out anytime they want. And blacks would talk to them. You know, blacks would not talk to a lot of white reporters. And so their power goes down. But the important point is blacks made these enormous numbers of gains, and they make incredible gains job-wise in World War II. I mean, the Labor Department looked at this after World War II and determined they made enormous number of gains in World War II. Rosie the Riveter types that worked building ships and planes and tanks, and women that flooded into federal agencies in Washington, D.C. And a lot of this, in terms of the whites, in their eyes, couldn't be helped because so many men went off to be in the service that needed people to work. Okay, and here's this black workforce ready to go into these places and work. Well, they make these enormous gains, then the black press starts going down in influence and power. And at that point, I used the kind of term, they handed off the baton to the people that were going to be big in the civil rights movement. It was a lot of ministers, not all of them were ministers. Almost all of them were black. But they handed off, and the civil rights movement started at this certain stage and then went further in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. If you had not had the black press around from 1910 to 1950, pushing for more equality, leading readers pushing for more equality, civil rights movement would have definitely started at a much lower level than it did. In other words, blacks wouldn't have had as many equalities as they did, and maybe it wouldn't have accomplished as much as it did. So the black press was this piece from 1910 to 1950 that went as far as it could in helping blacks. And then when it started going down, the people in the civil rights movement took it up and went further. And so they really did alter American history, and they helped the civil rights movement because the civil rights movement was at a certain point where it could go higher. It would never have started at the level it did if you had not had the black press in there doing what it did for a 40-year period.
Nice. You've kind of really already touched it, but I guess in a sense, how has the black press shaped, or how's the black press impacted journalism today as a whole?
Well, that's a really hard kind of question to answer. If you know the history of the black press, it certainly showed what it, after the period from 1910 to 1950, it certainly showed what you could do if you went out there and led people and had a loud voice. Some people would say a radical voice. It certainly affected it that way. It also made whites eventually more cognizant of black areas in this country, and I'm talking about black communities or black parts of cities and stuff, and the news value of what was going on there. I mean, until you get to the 1950s and 60s, you have virtually the white press, and I'm talking about both broadcast and print, virtually ignoring black areas of towns, black regions, because they just don't think there's anything worth reporting there. And they certainly proved that there was. And they were helped by a few famous blacks, whether it's Booker T. Washington or someone else. And so they made a difference in the way that whites suddenly started looking at blacks and looking at the fact of what could black reporters do for us. And as I mentioned yesterday, it's very interesting to think that in the late 60s, there was an article about coverage of blacks by the white press in Newsweek magazine. And one of the editors in the South in a city made the comment that he now had 3 blacks covering black areas of this city. And he gushed, we've discovered a new country. And I thought, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. It was like, it was there all the time. They just ignored it. Now suddenly they recognize, well, Jesus, maybe there's some news interest in this. You know, some things we ought to write about. And I don't, it's kind of a hard question to answer, but the black press definitely made a difference.
Well, you've answered all my questions, and I'm honored to be able to talk to you and gain this feedback on what you've been telling me, and I just thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad to do it. Like I say, I was an accidental traveler. I discovered this. And when I say an accidental traveler, let me go a little bit on that, just to explain what I really mean by that. I grew up basically in the Southwest, and from kindergarten through 12th grade, I went to public schools. And in that entire span of 13 years, only 1 year did I go to school with 2 blacks. The rest of the time, it was mostly whites. There were probably a few Indians, American Indians, and there's a few Asians maybe, but only 2 blacks 1 year, okay? So I grew up not around blacks, okay? I never saw a black newspaper. I knew nothing about black newspapers. Then I went to college at Baylor. And Baylor, I was there from 1959 to 63. Baylor would not allow blacks to go to school. It was the world's largest Southern Baptist institution. It was a private school. They could do whatever they wanted. They would not take blacks, okay? So I went to college as an undergraduate, went to school with no blacks, all right? And as an aside here, it's very interesting what happened a few years later when Texas played Penn State in the Cotton Bowl, and Penn State, which had about half blacks on its team, slaughtered Texas in this game. Suddenly, the Southwest Conference, which Baylor was in, decided it had to have black football players. And so it took football to integrate the Southwest Conference. I mean, there were blacks at the University of Texas, but not a lot of them. But football did it, okay? So I went to college around no blacks. Then I went out and worked and for 8 years, worked with no blacks. I worked both as a sports writer at 3 different papers, including the Atlanta Journal in the South. And then I worked at Harvard and the University of Louisville in sports information. No blacks. Now I was around some black athletes, but I didn't work with blacks. Then I came back and I got a master's degree at Indiana. For the first time I was around blacks because we had some black students. And then I went and worked in Rochester, New York, and we had some black reporters, and I came here and got a doctorate, and there were some black doctoral students. So during this whole time till I started this dissertation, I knew nothing about the black press. I couldn't even have named one black newspaper. I'd never seen one, never read one. I just knew nothing about it till I started this. And so I got started on this subject by an archivist at the Roosevelt Library by accident. He mentioned this thing, and I got what he sent me, and then I got started. And suddenly it just opened up a whole new world for me. And I was kind of mesmerized by what I found, and one of the reasons it mesmerized me, it's weird how you grow up and you kind of develop stereotypes. I started reading the black newspapers, and I was reading primarily the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender because they were the 2 largest black newspapers. And I was reading this stuff, and I thought, damn, this is really pretty interesting and well written, you know. And I really found it interesting from the first because it was really well done. And what I particularly liked about the black press is the fact that this was not your normal newspaper. They were an adversarial newspaper. And so you would read their news stories, and maybe it'd be a couple of paragraphs which were like regular newspaper copy you'd find in a white press. And then suddenly you'd read a paragraph that was almost editorialized. And so they mixed this editorialized writing, they mixed this regular, what you'd call regular news writing, they mixed them together, and it was a potent kind of journalism. You know, I thought, damn, this is really good, you know. And so it wasn't that I ever thought blacks weren't as capable as whites of writing good newspapers. I just never knew about this kind of journalism, and I was mesmerized once I got to reading it and saw what they were doing, and this adversarial advocacy way of writing was just stunning. I mean, I found that really interesting, and of course that would be totally against the ethics of white publications to write back this, but the black publications didn't have this ethics code like the white papers did. And so I got to reading this and got really interested in it, and then I'm looking at stuff that no one's ever looked at before. And it was really quite interesting how I got onto a subject that people generally ignored. And so I did my dissertation. It became a book, and then I spoke several times at the Smithsonian, and I spoke at the National D-Day Museum and other places. And as I went around, I noticed that I was telling people new stories and giving them new information about blacks and black history that they did not know. And the thing that's really been interesting to me is that if you look back now, you'll notice that there's several of us that really got people interested in looking at black history and the black press, and we kind of became the leaders of pushing for more. And that really wasn't my goal when I did this, but I look back now and I kind of realize that's what happened, was that we kind of led the way. And so in the last 25 years in mass communication history, and I'm talking about where you have meetings and people give papers and people publish books and people publish things in journals, the two areas that have suddenly blossomed enormously, and there wasn't much being written before then, was on blacks and women. And now these two areas are going strong. A lot more is being written, and I'm kind of proud of the fact that I was one of the leaders of starting what happened to writing about blacks, and it was quite an accident. I don't know. I loved it. I've made a lot of friends by doing this, and I'm proud I did it, because a lot of people looked at me from where I came from the Southwest, and not going to school with blacks. A lot of people looked at me and couldn't believe that I was writing on this subject, or I was like this. And the biggest compliment that I think I ever got was I did my dissertation. I sent it off to Oxford University Press, and they published it. And the editor called me right before they put it in print and said, "We're just astonished how non-biased you are." And I thought, I have really succeeded. Because I never thought I was biased against blacks, but people, whites, look at that and they think, how can you be non-biased about this? And I was. And in a way, it's given me a way to look at blacks in this country and have more appreciation of blacks and the history and what they've gone through to get where they were. And it's just been a happy thing for me to do.
Well, Dr. Patrick Washburn, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much. Do you want to add anything else, or?
No, that's probably about it.